Greetings et bienvenue. I'm Stephen Saideman. I'm the director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network and Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University. Today, we bring together diverse perspectives on how Canada reacted to 9/11, both internationally and domestically. The focus for much of that time frame was on foreign groups based on an extreme form of a religion. Today's terrorist threats are much more clearly homegrown in the form of white supremacy, incel violence, far-right terrorism that have harmed more Canadians than those that we feared after 9/11. And so the question is, what can we learn from the past that will help us react better in the future? What we'll do today is I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and after each presents their initial thoughts, I will ask some questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We hope that the conversation that takes place will help to inform the public and the policy community as we grapple with the challenge of extremism. I should also let you know, I'll put it in the chat, that we created a video of interviews with both decision makers from that day and analysts of defense and security today, asking them what they remember of that day, their reactions, and their assessment of how Canada reacted over the past 20 years. Before going further, we should note that the CDSN's headquarters is at Carleton University, as is the headquarters of the CSIDS, the Center for Security, Intelligence, Defense Studies. And Carleton University is located on unceded Algonquin territory, which is home to the Anishinaabe Nation. Today's speakers, I'll briefly introduce them, and then we'll get going. The first speaker is Tabasum Akseer. She is the Director of Policy and Research at the Asia Foundation's Afghanistan office. She oversees the Foundation's annual survey of the Afghan people, the broadest and longest running public opinion survey in the country. She also managed a capacity building program for the Afghan government. Kerry Buck was most recently Assistant Secretary to the Treasury Board from 2018 to 2021. Before that, she was Canada's ambassador to and permanent representative at Nato from 2015 to 2018. She served in a variety of capacities before that as a career diplomat, including working at DFATE, when it was known as DFATE, now known as Global Affairs Canada, leading the government's task force for Afghanistan. Sabine Nölke is an international lawyer specializing on international peace and security, human rights, terrorism, humanitarian law, and international and transnational criminal law. She is Director General of the Non-Proliferation and Security Threat Reduction Bureau, and she has served in a variety of other capacities, including Ambassador to the United Kingdom and Permanent Representative to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Navaid Aziz is an Imam, born and raised in Montreal, Quebec, and he has served as an Imam in Calgary for just under a decade with the Islamic Information Society of Calgary. Since 2018, he has been consulting for the Organization for the Prevention of Violence. So what I'd like to do now is throw it over to Tabasum, who will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll go in the order of the folks I've just introduced. Thank you. Tabasum, take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again, Stephen and colleagues, for the opportunity to contribute to this very meaningful and timely discussion on the lessons learned in Afghanistan and in Canada's reaction to 9/11. The Taliban's march into Kabul on August 15th and the collapse of the Western-backed government, it triggered a series of events, not just related to security, but also related to what some are calling a humanitarian disaster. I'll discuss a little bit about where we are in Afghanistan right now, followed by the Canadian role in Afghanistan, although I admit my co-panelists are much better positioned to speak about Canada's foreign policy response. And then I'll also talk about the past 20 years in Afghanistan, some of the changes that we've seen before getting into a little bit of speculation on where we can go from here and how to get there in Afghanistan. So where we are right now in Afghanistan is a series of very unfortunate events. There's the COVID-19 pandemic, a deteriorating economy, drought, weak or poor service delivery, a brain drain caused by the exodus of academics and professionals, and the gap in delivery of essential humanitarian services provided by the international community. International aid agencies, including the UN and Doctors Without Borders, have raised the alarm about an impending humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. and are warning us that the country's vulnerable healthcare system is facing a potential collapse. This loss of essential programming that has been a crutch for Afghans have been abruptly halted, and we're only starting to see the effects of that right now. In terms of Canada's role in Afghanistan, while we formally withdrew our military from our military role in 2014, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced a more politically engaged approach to the country. So since 2014, the Canadian focus was more on development, education, and women's rights. In fact, Global Affairs Canada has long supported the Asia Foundation's Women's Empowerment Program, which supports the capacity and activities of women's organizations and movements seeking to empower women and girls, advance the protection of women's and girls' rights, and achieve gender equality in Afghanistan. When looking at the past 20 years, there are multiple sources we can consider to measure both the gains, progress, and achievements. Of course, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, provides a series of lessons learned focused mostly on the US, but we can also extrapolate for a Canadian perspective. The big lessons from SIGAR were focused on strategy, sustainability, timeline, personnel, insecurity, context, monitoring, and evaluation. The report is available online for further details. And again, the Canadian government can, from a Canadian perspective, we can extrapolate. I won't talk too much about the SIGAR. I want to explore some of the other sources for giving some of the other sources available that can give us evidence of what has been achieved. Our Asia Foundation's annual nationwide survey of the Afghan people is one of those sources. Since 2007 or since 2004, we've interviewed over 130,000 Afghans across the country. The Survey of the Afghan People, or SAP, is an unmatched barometer of Afghan public opinion over time. Covering all 34 provinces, the surveys provide decision makers with vital data relevant to governance, policy, and development. It also gauges opinion on national mood, security, economic growth, unemployment, development, service delivery, and so on. With the exception of 2020, we've run this survey annually since 2005, and we can measure changes in public opinion over much of the past 20 years. Some of the key changes we've seen since 2005 or 2007 are increasing pessimism in the direction of the country. In 2006, pessimism about the direction of the country was 21%. This rose to 58% in 2009. Insecurity has always been a prime reason for pessimism amongst Afghans. It was 60% in 2004 and soared to 75% in 2019. When we asked Afghans about what institutions should be protected in peace negotiations, 87% said that the current constitution is very important or somewhat important to be protected. This is followed by strong central government, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, equality among different groups of people, women's rights, democratic system, the judiciary. Foreign economic assistance was also important at 73%. However, the presence of foreign military forces and protecting those was only 46% in 2019. Over the years, we've also seen fear among Afghans increase dramatically from 40% to 75% between 2006 and 2019. When we asked Afghans who provided security in their local area, in 2019, surprisingly, 39% of Afghans said people themselves are responsible for providing security. In 2009, we asked Afghans about the levels of sympathy for armed opposition groups. 22% said that they had sympathy for armed opposition groups, and this decreased down to 5% in 2019. Sympathy for the Taliban was at 4%, and sympathy for Daesh was at 0%. Among the 4% and the 0% who said that they had sympathy, the most common reasons for why they had sympathy for these armed opposition groups was simply because they're Afghans, they're Muslim, or they don't know why they have sympathy. We also gauged Afghans' perception of corruption. In 2006, 42% of Afghans said that corruption was a major problem in their daily life. This soared to 68% in 2019. We also gauged the percentage of Afghans who said that their financial and economic opportunities for their household, including employment opportunities, have deteriorated. On women's rights, we've seen increasing support for women's access to education from 2007 onwards to 2019. We've also seen increasing support for women's right to work outside of the home and increasing support for women's engagement in other types of civil liberties, such as voting. However, we also see that this support decreases among both men and women where travel is required or where there's mixed gender. For example, support for women seeking education generally decreases where we ask about educational opportunities outside of the province or even outside of the country. And that's consistent with both men and women. And for women's right to work outside of the home, although this is extremely high, support for women working in female-dominated areas such as hospitals and clinics, we see this decrease rapidly among both men and women for mixed gender environments. For example, offices where men and women work together. On women's dress, or how women should dress, we see minor differences in support. In fact, when we showed Afghans a series of images ranging from an ultra-conservative burqa to a scarf and no scarf, we see high support is for women wearing the burqa. In 2020, because of the COVID pandemic, we were unable to conduct the survey of the Afghan people in person. Instead, we pivoted to telephone surveys with 12,000 surveys conducted across 3 waves. We see consistent findings. We see that there are no significant differences for Afghans in allowing the Taliban to have a majority influence in the government. When we asked about whether or not Afghans would support a peace deal if women have an increased role in public, Afghans are more willing to support such a peace deal. They're also more willing to accept a peace deal if Islamic law is deemed higher than secular law. And similarly, they're also more willing to support a peace deal if they're able to democratically elect their leaders rather than to be an Islamic emirate. While these percentages are at the national level, we do see dramatic differences at the subnational or regional levels and among different demographic communities, especially where related to women's rights. What this tells us is that change takes time. Afghans have demonstrated with their responses to our survey questions the importance and value of cultural and religious values and norms that are in fact superseding others. The fact that informal institutions remain the most prominent for resolving disputes among Afghans is telling. To understand what the next 20 years will look like for Canada's engagement in Afghanistan, some background on where we are is required. So with the newly formed Islamic emirate, its caretaker government consists mostly of individuals that are on sanctions list, including the acting prime minister, who's on the UN sanctions list. This undoubtedly poses legal and political challenges. The main issue for the international community, including Canada, is how to deal with a listed entity. This poses limitations on what a government can do. And we've already seen NATO, the US, the IMF freeze funds. So we already see sanctions happening. However, the dilemma is that if you sanction the Taliban or the IEA government, then you disengage. And if you disengage, especially if Pakistan, India, China, and other regional players are involved, it could lead to more challenges. So if you do start engaging and you do start funding, how do you draw lines around programming and funding? Canada and the rest of the donor community will need to rely on a conditions-based approach with any prospective support or removal from the sanctions list. For example, how will the IEA approach women's rights, their access to education, access to healthcare, delivery of healthcare, violence against women, and so on? The Taliban will also need to act responsibly so that the international community recognizes them. They'll need to accept international conventions that the previous government has accepted and also provide justifications for any that they choose to walk away from. Many questions remain to be seen. What are the chances the government can continue, for example, what are the chances the government can continue with existing policies? What is clear is the use of evidence-based decision-making. I'm pleased to share news that we have completed data collection for 2021. More than 15,000 interviews with Afghans across the country have been conducted. The final interview was completed on August 2, 2021, so right before the Taliban took over. This will be a rich endline for the past gains and changes that have been achieved or missed in Afghanistan. The 2021 data will also serve as a baseline for what perceptions existed prior to the Taliban takeover. In interviews with men and women across the country, we have questions related to governance, the Taliban, international community, the importance of religion, culture, women's rights, and so on. These again will be essential in informing any decision making around policies in Afghanistan. Assuming that the international community, including Canada, remains active and interested in Afghanistan, any policies or funding for programming and humanitarian support should incorporate customized approaches and avoid using one-size solutions for the over 40 million people still in the country. One of the lessons learned from the past 20 years include neglecting the voices of diverse groups beyond the urban elites in Kabul. It remains critical to consider nuances between urban women in Kabul versus rural women in Kandahar. So thank you again for your time. I welcome any questions, especially related to our perception data from our survey of the Afghan people tool.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting, Tabasum. Our next speaker is Kerry Buck. Kerry, your turn.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'll start off by telling the story of what happened at NATO on 9/11 and the days after. And then I'll give you some of my own thoughts from the perspective of a practitioner of diplomacy, how I think 9/11 fundamentally shifted the ways in which the international community, the international multilateral system responds to conflict and terrorism. And then I'll explore where we find ourselves today, 20 years later, what went well, what went wrong. So walk back to September 11th, 2001. I wasn't at NATO. I was working for the Human Rights Commission, and it was in South Africa. I just finished the Durban Conference Against Racism, and that's a whole different story, and it's on the video that you mentioned at the beginning. But the story I want to tell you is about what happened at NATO that day and in the aftermath, as I said. I'm taking this from public accounts by the NATO Sec Gen of the time, Lord George Robertson, and from direct conversations I've had with the Canadian ambassador to NATO, David Wright, and with a former US colleague of mine, Nick Burns, who was then US ambassador to NATO. So the first plane hit the World Trade Center at 8:45 in the morning in New York on Tuesday, September 11th. And at that exact time in Brussels, the NATO Sec Gen was wrapping up his weekly offsite informal luncheon, working luncheon with all NATO ambassadors. This is a forum that has a long tradition, one that still goes on every Tuesday. And from my time at NATO, as NATO ambassador, I can tell you that it's the place where there's frank discussion and where much of the hard work is done that will later allow consensus to form. And that was important because that consensus is necessary to formal decisions at NATO. So this was the first such informal meeting after the summer session. So it was the first time they were all getting together. And Nick Burns, the American ambassador, had just arrived in Brussels 10 days before. So he was just meeting his colleagues. He didn't have those relationships where he could move things quickly necessarily. A note was run into the room, and it was delivered to the Sec Gen saying that one of the Twin Towers had been hit by a plane. A few minutes later, a second note was delivered advising of the attacks on the second tower in the Pentagon. And at that point, while it was clear it became clear this was a coordinated attack, it was still far from being clear who had perpetrated it and why. And you remember, this wasn't long after the Oklahoma bombing in the US, and it wasn't immediately evident that a homegrown terrorist attack could be entirely ruled out. So everyone rushed back to NATO headquarters. Lord Robertson called for the building to be evacuated, except for core staff. It was a military headquarters with a sizable US presence. It could have been a target. And then what happened then was 24 hours of very intense activity and formal discussion amongst key allies, overnight cables back to 19 capitals. 2 informal meetings of all NATO ambassadors followed on the evening of September 12th by a 5.5-hour formal meeting of the North Atlantic Council. And at 9:20 that night, NATO agreed that if it was determined that the attack had been directed from abroad against the US, it would be seen by NATO as an action covered by Article 5. So what is Article 5 and why does it matter? I don't want to be all lawyer. Sabine, you can be all lawyer after me. But so Article 5 is the collective defense provision of the NATO treaty, and I call it the Three Musketeers article, where an attack against one ally is seen as an attack against all. And this was the first time NATO had in its history invoked Article 5. And quietly behind the scenes, it was Canada. It was Canada's ambassador to NATO at the time, David Wright, who came up with that proposal to use Article 5. NATO works by absolute consensus, as I said. So if even one ally had objected, this wouldn't have happened. But in less than 24 hours after the attacks, the agreement of 19 NATO allies was achieved. So why did this matter? Why did the invocation of Article 5 matter? As Ambassador Wright put it when I was speaking to him most recently, this changed everything. What did it change? In practical terms, it pushed terrorism to the top of the NATO agenda, and it paved the way for NATO taking over responsibility for the International Stabilization Assistance Force for Afghanistan 2 years later in 2003, in what would become NATO's longest running military operation. But beyond the practical impact, from my perspective, 9/11 fundamentally changed NATO, and in some respects changed the way the entire international community responds to terrorism and conflict. And I see this in 4 ways. First, 9/11 saw NATO move to what NATO calls crisis management operations. That is, operations out of area beyond the territories of NATO allies in their immediate neighborhood. This was a fundamental policy shift. And while in any other instance, I would have expected certain allies to hesitate at such an expansion, the imperative of standing in solidarity with the US post 9/11 moved them fairly quickly to consensus. You might remember the headline of Le Monde in Paris a couple of days after September 11th with the headline, "Nous sommes tous Américains." So the entire North Atlantic Council moved to an endorsement of mentioning Article 5. The rationale in the early days of the 9/11 response for this kind of extension of NATO was tied to NATO's right of collective self-defense, buttressed by Article 51 of the UN Charter. And this legal argument carried through to the Chapter 7 mandate for ISAF in 2003 when NATO took over. So that was then. So walk forward 20 years from 2001 to today. Where is NATO today on the issue? As I said, fairly quickly after 9/11, crisis management out of area operations became one of the 3 core tasks of the alliance. And it's been reiterated as such by heads of state at multiple summits since that time. And in my opinion, it's now enshrined in the NATO canon. How often it happens will be dependent on other factors, but I think it's enshrined in the NATO canon. Second fundamental shift, NATO's immediate response to 9/11 strengthened the transatlantic bond. Prior to 9/11 and in its precedence of World War II, the transatlantic bond largely consisted of North American military assets moving eastward to deter threats to European territory. 9/11 saw military assets moving in the opposite direction, with NATO aerial surveillance planes patrolling the US eastern seaboard alongside US planes. So the transatlantic bond was strengthened in other ways at the time. Many NATO Canada immediately stepped up to participate in the US-led counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, what would become Operation Enduring Freedom, and to the ISAF stabilization mission. So bring that forward to today. Is that transatlantic bond still as strong today? I would argue it is, particularly as a result of the need to, I see your eyebrows go up, so I invite the audience to tell me I'm wrong, but I do believe that it is as strong, particularly as the result of the need to bolster NATO's deterrence to Russian aggression in Ukraine and in other parts of Europe. I also think that the transatlantic bond weathered the Trump era and will survive what some are calling President Biden's isolationist foreign policy. We've seen America turn inward and outward over the course of NATO, beginning from the very beginnings of NATO, and the relationship has survived. That being said, I think that Canada would be very smart to make a concerted effort to diversify and expand its international security alliances and partnerships. Third impact of 9/11 was that terrorism immediately rose to the top of the international security agenda. So this meant a practical shift, more international talk, more international action focused on counterterrorism, but it also entailed a policy shift. And from my perspective, that policy shift has a few aspects to it. Terrorism rose to the level of an international crime and a threat to international peace and security, and a reason to undertake collective defense. This in turn led to increasing application of the laws of war to terrorist acts and increasing use of internationalized military responses to terrorism, where previously this had largely been the domain or the province of cooperation amongst domestic police and intelligence services and domestic criminal prosecutions. But there's a broader policy impact too that I see, and that is the blurring of the line in international law between peace and war. So where are we today on this issue, or these multiple facets of this issue? I'd make a couple of points. I think the war on terror didn't really work. The number of terrorist attacks, the number of victims worldwide is, one source said 3 to 5 times higher today than in 2001. And we know that Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and their various affiliates remain active around the world. It did work in some ways for the US in that the number of foreign instigated terrorist attacks on US soil was much lower than elsewhere in the world. And in a way, maybe the focus on foreign instigated attacks may have diverted US attention from rising risk of domestic terror. On the broader policy shift with the blurring of the line between peace and war, I think this change as well is here to stay, and it forms a lot of the ongoing work at NATO and the UN on related issues like countering misinformation, drone warfare, etc. Finally and fourthly, the responses to 9/11 saw international military operations in Afghanistan morph from a counterterrorism mission to a counterinsurgency mission to a nation-building mission. And while NATO wasn't responsible for all nation-building aspects, much of this work was carried out by major aid donors like Canada, the UN, the EU, and others. But the breadth and scope of the NATO mission was unprecedented for NATO. So where are we today? And this is difficult. And I use the word explore at the beginning on purpose because just over a week after the end of the Afghanistan evacuations, I think it would be folly to make any clear pronouncements. But I do think there were certainly some gains. A whole generation of Afghan girls went to school. Women served as police, legislators, and journalists. There was more civic freedom and growing democratic consciousness for many Afghans. But as a nation building exercise, I think a hard and rigorous look needs to be taken in allied capitals, at NATO, and at the UN at what didn't work. The fact that efforts to build good governance were probably undermined by parallel counterterrorism operations. The massive flows of aid can often undermine anti-corruption efforts, for instance. But I don't believe that the effort of nation building as a goal of the international community is always futile. When it has adequate local ownership, local leadership, diverse and full representation in peace talks, for instance, I believe it can work. As I said, it's too soon to pronounce on what went wrong with the NATO Afghanistan mission, and much too soon to pronounce definitively on what it means for the international security apparatus over the longer term. But what is certain is that ongoing international engagement to try and avoid humanitarian and development disaster in Afghanistan is urgently needed. And what is also certain from my perspective is that some humility must be brought to bear as the international community takes that deep look at what went wrong and what went right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And before Sabine goes, I should correct myself. She was the ambassador to the Netherlands, not to the United Kingdom, which helped to facilitate her being attached to all those international organizations that are based in The Hague, including a variety of legal international criminal tribunals. So take it away, Sabine.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. One kingdom is not like the other. Thanks so much. Really interesting presentation so far. I'd like to narrow things a little bit and look at Canada's post 9/11 response and what lessons we can draw from that, bearing in mind that you're looking now forward to the threat of right-wing extremism. Our response, I think, was similar to responses to terrorist acts from in other countries. Namely, we created some very good, substantive, useful policies. But overall, if you step way back and look at the big picture, all those responses tended to be responsive, subject to political pressures and perceptions, sometimes ad hoc, and rarely proactive or really looking at the long term and looking holistically at all the issues related to terrorist activity. Now, that is my thesis, and I'm going to look at this from three particular points, bearing in mind that my perch at the time was that I was with the Department of Foreign Affairs, not with a domestic law enforcement agency. In domestic law, of course, we created the Anti-Terrorism Act. That was adopted by Parliament approximately, I think, 6 or 8 weeks after the attacks on September 11th. Amended the Criminal Code, the Official Secrets Act, the Canada Evidence Act, Proceeds of Crime Money Laundering Act, and a number of other pieces of legislation. And so it wasn't really a standalone act, but an amending statute. And already the piecemeal approach, I think, becomes a little bit problematic. It formed a key component to the anti-terrorism plan at the time. That was the public statement with 4 objectives. Number 1, preventing terrorists from getting into Canada and protect Canadians everywhere from terrorist acts. Number 2, activate tools to identify, prosecute, convict, and punish terrorist offenders. 3, to keep the Canada-US border secure and a contributor to economic security. And 4, to work with the international community to bring terrorists to justice and address the root causes of violence. Again, Kerry, I think, focused on the military response. This is the domestic legislative response. All of that was great. One of the problems, though, of course, was the speed with which the legislation, all those pieces were passed. For example, parts of it enacted or allowed us to ratify 2 important international legal instruments, namely the Convention on the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings and the Convention on the Suppression of Terrorist Financing. Both of those had been signed much earlier, bombings in 97, financing in 2000. So if you had really wanted to take as a cohesive legislative approach, you know, there were a lot of wasted time. Instead, it was done responsively and as well in response to UN Security Council Resolution 1373, which imposed some of the obligations of those treaties as legally binding obligation to UN member states. So again, it wasn't a long-term approach. It was something fairly short, quickly done and responsive. The legislation itself had sunsetting provisions and a provision for legislative review, which weren't great choices, but politically necessary in order to get the things passed. But then for the next 3 years, you know, a lot of domestic actors ended up having to focus on the legislative review rather than, you know, actually work on the issues that it raised. There were a lot of issues resulting from that, from Canada's legislative response, terrorist listings, many lawsuits. You're familiar, of course, with the Abdel Razik case. He was listed under the Al-Qaeda and Taliban regulations, prevented from traveling, sued the government for his mobility rights. We suffered some reputational issues from our approach to security detentions. I remember the facility where we kept a number of suspected terrorists against whom we could not file charges because they hadn't actually done anything yet. They were suspected of being engaged in terrorist activities. They were detained in an immigration facility in Kingston, which was referred to as Guantanamo North. So immediately there were human rights issues raised as a result of the Canadian legislation. Then following that, a lot of political posturing in relation to terrorism. We had one private member's bill that tried to make suicide bombings a particularly heinous offense, which always baffled me because usually the perpetrator isn't around to be prosecuted. We had the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, which had really no substantive I will argue, no substantive legal value, but allowed for some Iran and Syria bashing, and in the event ended up costing us an embassy in Tehran. So legislative response is very much subject to politics. Internationally, Kerry mentioned the shift in terms of terrorist responses from the law enforcement paradigm to the law of armed conflict paradigm, which of course had an impact in Canada. The conflict in Afghanistan particularly, but elsewhere around the world, was asymmetrical. You have states on one side, private non-state actors on the other, which led to very difficult issues at international humanitarian law. It led to issues relating to our forces' rules of engagement. Are any conflict detainees who are terrorists and not military personnel, are they prisoners of war? You have Guantanamo Bay and everything that is attached to, and I will just show you guys my mug that I have here in that particular context. We have, again, a lot of the responses there, however, were not determined by politics so much as by what are our allies doing, what do we need to do, what do we need to be seen to be doing. And some of the actions were, of course, contradictory to existing legal obligations, such as, the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. It also forced internally in Canada a reckoning with issues of the extraterritorial application of the Charter, a number of high-profile cases that Kerry is more than passingly familiar with. Amnesty International suing Canada on the handling of detainees in Afghanistan. Finally, the last point in Canada's response is programming. And in other words, where did we put some money to help things along? I mentioned earlier the building of capacity as one of the goals of Canada's counterterrorism strategy. And there, I think we did a lot of good. A lot of useful things were done, but still, by and large, those things were very much subject to the vagaries of politics. Probably, arguably, the most successful program was Canada's WMD threat reduction program, which was aimed at addressing proliferation risks of weapons of mass destruction that might be falling into the hands of non-state actors. This came out of the Kananaskis G7, or at the time it was still G8 summit in 2002, led to $100 million a year in programming for nuclear, radiological, biological, and chemical security. It moved from Russia in 2010, got a worldwide mandate, and was subsequently used to do a lot of useful work in Syria with relations to chemical weapons from there, and with the IAEA as well. So that's and biosecurity, trying to stop pathogens such as the Ebola virus from falling into the hands of organizations like Boko Haram, who had declared their interest in getting their hands on these things. So a lot of useful work done there, benefiting very much from coordination with other partners. And at the heart of this program continues to be prevention rather than response, which I think is one of the keys for its success, although it makes it very difficult to measure. How do you measure things that didn't happen? I think is always a problem for politicians. Canada also created a counterterrorism capacity building program, which focused on law enforcement, military intelligence, countering violent extremism, foreign terrorist fighters, countering the financing of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. That has a global mandate and addresses acute threats to Canada and to Canadian interests, which has resulted in pushing the program into specific areas closely in our hemisphere, in Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean, but also in the Sahel region of North Africa, following the abduction of Robert Fowler and Louis Gay by AQIM, in the Middle East and North Africa, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and South and Southeast Asia. The problem with that kind of programming, of course, is limited funds, widespread areas of interest, which means not much money to face a gigantic problem. But there were some direct results, particularly in Mali and in some areas. We had some very, very notable successes with that particular program. But one of the downsides is that for a certain period in its existence, that program was was really linked to ministerial travel and announceables. Ministers traveling to country X, do we have anything we can announce, rather than following a coherent strategy that was developed by our experts. So again, that's where the political influence comes in. So the conclusion, I think, from all these examples, and I really want to keep this short, is that counterterrorism strategies are very much limited by politics. There are no votes in prevention in things that don't happen. They don't score points for politicians. What you need in order to deploy programming is a trigger. And 9/11, of course, was such a trigger. High visibility, political pressure to respond. All of the issues addressed subsequently had existed before, had been, experts had militated to try and get them addressed, but nothing happened until there was that pressure from the political level in response to this, to the attack. Opportunities were seized to do a lot of good, but the speed and again, the political imperatives that informed some of the actions meant that some things were left on the floor or not really thoroughly thought out. Now, you'd want to translate that today and the response to alt-right radicalization and right-wing white supremacist extremism. Some of the stuff that we've done in response to 9/11 can be very much translated. The countering violent extremism, looking at the psychological factors behind, the readiness to commit terrorist acts, and et cetera, et cetera. To some extent, though, the war paradigm that follows terrorism around these days, which Kerry mentioned, impedes the ready translation of some of the issues and some of the activities that we've done, I think. And at least it causes people to look at it through a slightly wrong prism and think that maybe some of those responses aren't appropriate. Then again, politics, as long as they're supposedly centrist politicians who don't want to alienate some of their potential fringe voters, we can't expect meaningful concerted preventative action unless there's an enormous trigger event happening again, which, Lord forbid, will not happen. But I don't think that gravel throwing on the campaign trail is enough to make Canadians realize that right-wing extremism in this country is a problem that needs to be addressed coherently and thoroughly. So those are my slightly depressing remarks, and obviously I'd be very happy to entertain questions on any of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabine. And you've been very patient, Navaid. Now you get the chance to speak more to the domestic dynamics of the past 20 years. So take the floor.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much to my panelists as well. Tabasum, Sabine, and Kerry, did a phenomenal job presenting their viewpoints. So I want to start off my discussion with a personal story. I was in the city of Medina in Saudi Arabia when 9/11 happened, and there was only one public accessible TV, which was at the local McDonald's. So I had to go to the local McDonald's to be able to see what was happening in New York City at that time. And at that time, I couldn't understand the impact that it would have on my life personally, as well as the impact that it would have on the Muslim community. And I learned about that impact as I was traveling back. So just to give you some context, prior to the year before 9/11, I traveled back from Saudi Arabia to New York City, and I was wearing my religious clothing, which consisted of a disdasha or a thobe. I had my religious hat on, and I traveled from Saudi Arabia to JFK Airport with that garb on. And I transferred from JFK to LaGuardia Airport in a cab that I shared with executives from Shell and from Siemens. And we had this amazing conversation during the ride. 9/11 happens the following year. I come back during the summertime again. And at the airport in Jeddah, I remember I had purchased a New York Yankees baseball cap. And prior to that, I had a New York Giants football jersey, as well as some Adidas track pants that I wore, hoping that I'd be as conspicuous as possible and not to be cited as a visible Muslim. And I remember arriving into JFK Airport, and as soon as I got off the plane, they asked me, "Mr. Aziz, can you please step to the side?" And I was held for interrogation for about 2 hours. But that wasn't really, what made me understand that life had changed. That same transit that I was doing from JFK to LaGuardia, this time as I'm crossing the road, I have my luggage with me, and my watch kept on hitting the handle of my luggage. That as I'm crossing the road, you can hear this clanking sound till my wrist band actually snaps. And what barely took a second to fall from my wrist to the ground felt like such a prolonged period of time, because I was able to look at my wristband falling, as well as the reactions of the people around me and how they were reacting to this. And then eventually my watch fell to the ground, the face cracked, and there was a sense of relief amongst the people. And I'm like, what just happened? It was only my watch that fell. But people assumed that because it was me, a man with a beard that happened to look Muslim, that my watch was some sort of bomb that was about to detonate. And it was at that point that I realized that life for myself and Muslims across North America had drastically changed. So I believe these personal experiences are very, very relevant when we talk about, Canada and North America in general, responses to 9/11. There was a huge impact on people of color, particularly the Muslim community, particularly women that wore hijab. And we continue to see that to this day. Now, I want to highlight a couple of things that happened that often go under the radar. And I'm really glad that some of my panelists have addressed this already. But let's look at compensation that Canada has paid to individuals that were unjustly treated. So we have the case of Abdulrazak that was already mentioned, but we also have Muayyad Nuruddin, Ahmed Abdul Maati, and Abdullah Maliki, each of them given approximately $10 million. We have the case of Omar Khadr that was very, very prominent in the news, also given approximately $10 million. And then we also have Maher Arar, who was also given approximately $10 million. So this shows us that Canada, to a certain degree, was complicit in unjust practices as a result of this war on terror and as a result of counterterrorism practices post 9/11. Let's talk about the Toronto 18 case. The Toronto 18 case was perhaps the most prolific terrorism case in Canada's history. Now, if you look at some of the individuals, when they were asked what were their primary motivations behind this, they said we wanted to seek justice for what was happening in Afghanistan to our fellow brothers and sisters. And we see that the Toronto 18 case had a direct relationship. I wouldn't call it causation, but at least some sort of correlation to what was happening overseas. So in terms of Canada's response in Afghanistan, there was a response to that we have to seek justice, we have to seek revenge, and therefore we're going to domestically act. This is jumping the gun straight ahead. But if you look at, United States response to Iraq and what happened in 2004 onwards, as well as the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein and the role that other governments played in facilitating that, if that didn't happen, would Daesh have been as successful as they were in taking over that territory and quote unquote establishing their caliphate? That is a question that does need to be asked. Now, getting back to Canada, we saw an increased surveillance of the Muslim community. So this meant that anyone that would go to a mosque would sometimes come under the radar of being surveyed. And that was very, problematic. And I talk about this from a personal level, where they show up at your workspace and it naturally makes you seem as if you have done something wrong because people don't know why you're being visited. They're, calling you at home, asking to meet with you, and multiple other problems that are happening. There was also infiltration of mosques where, mosques that were deemed suspicious, they were sent informants therein. And, this was again created a distrust amongst the community because you never knew who you were speaking to. And this actually separated communities at that time. This also created a children's no-fly list, which up until 2018 was a huge problem, where individuals that had Muslim names, my daughter herself was a victim of this, her name being Alia Aziz, someone matched her name supposedly. And from childhood, every time she would fly, she would have to get a special clearance before she could fly. And this started as young as, 11 months old. And it makes you seem that it makes you wonder how many other children were there that went through such problems. And they continue to go through such problems because we created this mechanism that could not be fixed as an ad hoc response to 9/11. Now, let's jump to the present. We continue to see the demonization of the Muslim community, but on a different level now, and that is in terms of physical attacks. So, we were talking about the political responses to terrorism attacks, and I believe that needs to be highlighted, that a lot of our responses were to win political votes and to show that we take very stern and staunch actions towards those that threaten our freedom and our liberties. While theoretically it sounds very noble and novel that we're doing something to respond to these threats, but at a practical level, we're harming our own citizens. And we created a barbaric hotline. We created a huge issue of women wearing niqab, during their ceremonies, when historically speaking, it was only like 2 or 3, and again, demonizing the Muslim community. And that public rhetoric, further perpetuated the growing Islamophobia from right-wing extremism, but actually made it mainstream into the news itself. And thereafter, in 2017, we saw the Quebec mosque shooting. Recently, we saw the London attack, where a family was killed. And while that is horrific, my heart grieves and pains even more for the young boy, Faiz, 9 years old, who has none of his family left, where he now has to celebrate his birthday alone. He will not have a mother to celebrate Mother's Day with. He will not have a father to look up to and to take care of him. And he's in this world all alone now, all of a result of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant rhetoric. We look at the case of Mohammed Aslam Zafis, the caretaker of the IMO mosque, who was killed while taking care of the mosque in September of 2020. And now the last point of women of color wearing hijab, particularly in Alberta, sadly, it's almost a weekly occurrence that a woman of color wearing hijab is attacked. And it's so frequent that news agencies don't even cover it anymore, because it's just become an everyday mainstay of what's happening in life. Now, all this to say, what lessons have we learned? I think that's one of the challenges, that theoretically, we can have a panel discussion today and we can talk about lessons that we've learned, but what does that look like practically in terms of policy, in terms of change? And I think that's where the deeper discussion needs to be done, that if we as individuals are not willing to challenge our own biases and our own prejudices, how can we expect that to happen at an institutional and national level, particularly when it comes to the policymakers? When there needs to be a time where we feel comfortable ourselves. And we saw that after 9/11, we did become very uncomfortable, and that is why we were able to make policy changes so quickly. But to now, when the attacks are not happening upon people that look like ourselves and talk like ourselves and act like ourselves, those policy changes are coming a lot slower. So I think we do need to look deeper down inside of ourselves and consider everyone to be equal and be inclusive of everyone, and consider all Canadians equal, regardless of the color of their skin or the languages that they speak or where they were born prior to coming to Canada, if there's a different ethnic background. So I think those are deeper questions that need to be asked. Now, is there anything positive that could come out of this? I think without a shadow of a doubt, the fact that today we are having this discussion is a positive sign. I think right after 9/11, it is very unlikely that you would have seen an imam on a panel of prestigious panelists like we have today. So I think moving forward, we are heading in the right direction, but it is too slow and often too late. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You raised a lot of questions and raised some themes that I think are that we're all thinking about these days. And before I ask a couple questions, I'd like to remind the audience that there's a Q&A function. And if you hit the button and ask questions, we will sort through them and ask them of our speakers. I think there's some common themes through some of the presentations. And I think one of them is that when you try to make people more secure, the question is whether you actually do that, or do you make people less secure, or do you make some people more secure at the expense of others? And when we take a look at 9/11 and the responses to 9/11, we all felt a tremendous amount of fear because North America had been attacked. Canadians had been killed in New York. We had planes from Europe landing at Gander, and there's a lot of uncertainty about our airspace at that moment in time, and it created a lot of fear, and it created a sense of urgency for many of the policies that several of you had discussed. But in the rush to make policy, we made policies that might have been seen as doing something, but perhaps in their effects did more harm than good, or the mix of harm and good were, where we paid attention to some of the things that gained us a little bit more security, but we didn't pay as much attention to things that lost us security. And so I guess one of the questions I want to ask each of you is, looking forward, are there policies that were developed either internationally or domestically that could be not tossed out entirely? So let's think about reform first before we get into radical renovation. Are there policies that were developed that can be redirected or reformed so that we're more conscious of the costs and the consequences? So that way we at least reduce the damage that we do as we try to accomplish our goals in international relations and in Canadian life. So we'll just go in the order of the speakers again on this question. Tabasum?
Thank you, Stephen. I'll keep my response very short, as I think my co-panelists are probably better positioned to respond to this question. I think that the one thing that we can do better today is having more articulated definition of terrorism and anti-terrorism. I think in its current place, both terrorism and anti-terrorism are very vague. And while in some instances, while that does give us a lot of it kind of gives us a lot of leeway and what constitutes as a terrorist act or what doesn't. I think we need a more carefully defined term, and that's just not in Canada. It's also amongst our partners in the UK, the US, New Zealand, and Australia.
Thank you. Kerry?
Okay, I'll focus my answer on how we do international peace support operations, because you could answer it so many different ways. A few lessons I think we were learning through Afghanistan, but certainly did not perfect. First, when you're doing a military-focused international peace support operation, I think you really need to keep your eye on the softer security aspects of those interventions. And the way you can do that is to ensure that there's a whole of government or a whole of Canada approach to it. So from the beginning of a conflict through the life cycle of a conflict, understand that you probably should be building up civil society capacity and working with civil society and listening to them more. The survey that Tabasum spoke about, that would have been invaluable at the beginning when we were working on Afghanistan, because otherwise you're working through anecdotes, right? So use those softer non-military aspects, and also think about using your military for soft security support as well. Training, but not training in the way that it was done at the beginning of ISAF, very active kind of, but building capacity of forces. So a much more complete view of how you do international peace support operations that includes building up not just the military, but much better job of building up governance from the ground up, much better job of engaging with civil society and helping build capacity of civil society on the ground. When you're talking about government, look at those non-military, non-security parts of it, because we saw in Afghanistan, if you hollow out support, if the support of the populace for the government is hollowed out over a number of years, it will fall pretty fast. So your nation building adventures really are futile. Oh.
Thank you. Sabine?
Yeah, following up on that, engagement of civil society, absolutely. I think one of the issues, I think, for us as Canadians to respond to the rise in extremism we see in our own country is that we have to take the politics out of it. And for that to happen, you need to actually get our political parties to, hard as this may be, to sing from the same hymn sheet. So don't point fingers at each other necessarily, but get the parties together. I know this is horribly naive, but we used to be able to do this. 30, 40 years ago, we did these things where we got cross the aisle support for initiatives. In this particular case, I think we need to throw a whole whack of money at countering the kind of extremism we see, which means involving countering disinformation, having a coherent policy on removing some of the extremist rhetoric from our public spaces, going into the communities and finding out what are people actually there saying, what do they want, what do they need, that drives them to extremism. And the pandemic and the anti-vax response and a lot of the radicalization we see as a result of that should be a very, very good trigger for having those kinds of discussions, investigations, and then also coherent responses. But it has to be apolitical. It has to get the buy-in from all the parties so that you don't get one party trying to score cheap points of certain aspects of a program, because if you do that, it ain't gonna work.
I'm sorry, but as a political scientist, I can't help but think that
in the sky, right?
Well, I think the question is not how to make things apolitical, but how to make the politics work in a positive direction.
Yeah,
right.
Well, I was ambassador in the Netherlands, as we pointed out. And when it comes to a big issue that requires really a generational strategy, in the Netherlands, it started with dike building in the 14th century and continues today. It continues today with responses to climate change. They create these commissions that are based on academia, on civil society, and business, and on government, and get all of these folks together so you can get a coherent societal buy-in for a long-term strategy that will survive the next 3-year-long government. Because if you change everything every 3 or 4 years, you're not going to succeed in some of these issues that require long-term approaches.
Yeah, but the challenge is that dikes or the rising floodwaters or whatever is not as partisan as some of these issues. That one of the challenges we face is we have the Conservative Party of Canada facing a threat from its right wing. And so it has to figure out whether to try to play to the right wing and lose the moderates, or appeal to moderates and then lose the right wing. And so we're seeing today that the polls of the PPC have now gone above 5%, which is not good from a standpoint of how do we want our country to move forward together. But I want the participants here to speak rather than me. So Navaid, what is your take on some of the things that we can learn from going forward from the mixed, the attempt to provide security, actually creating insecurity for people?
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm actually going to take this opportunity to summarize and build upon, the previous positions. So starting with Tabasum, I think she made a very valid point in terms of definitions, not only with terrorism and counterterrorism, but even definitions of radicalization and extremism and violent extremism. There's a huge problem within the industry of how we define these terms, and the lack of definition has, just perpetuated the problem itself. So from an academic standpoint, much more needs to be done. There was a Professor Schmidt, if I'm not mistaken, from Leiden University. He actually found 150 different definitions for the word terrorism, which is just crazy. It's insane. Then going on to what Kerry was mentioning, and what I took away from her statement was about foreign policy in particular. And there's this wonderful quote that I came across a couple of years back that said, show me a country that has a problem with jihadism, and I'll show you a country that has a problem with foreign intervention. And I think this is something that needs to be looked at time and time again. What role does foreign intervention play in the creating of not only domestic international terrorism, but also domestic terrorism? There is that correlation that needs to be addressed and need to be looked at. So those softer approaches definitely are needed, and we need to reassess our position as Canadians as to being, I don't know what word I want to use over here, but being consistent in all of our approaches. So when Syrians are being killed, we're choosing not to get directly involved, but when someone else is, all of a sudden we're on the ground. What is, behind that decision? And then the last point to Sabine's point, which I think was a great point, and it is, very idealistic, very, utopian in approach. But if you look at what's happening in politics, I believe, and this is my own personal opinion, that a lot of politicians have lost their own moral and ethical compass. It's literally become, I will do whatever I can in order to win those votes. And we've seen this particularly with the Conservative Party, where as of recent, several of them were outed for previous posts against the Muslim community, yet it was not enough to force them to step down, nor did the Conservative Party force them to step down. And I think that had they spoken against other minority groups within Canada, those resignations would have been instantaneous. So there's again a need to look deeper down inside. Where are our own individual moral and ethical compasses, and why is it that they cannot be fixed? And until we ask ourselves those deeper questions inside, every institution, every party is just a conglomerate of its members, right? And until we fix those members, we can't fix our society. Those are my humble and simple thoughts.
Well, I think you're really on target with what you said there. One of the challenges that we've seen lately is we had one of the debates last night, and one of the issues that came up was Bill 21, and all the parties, because they're so eager to get votes in Quebec, are not willing to run away from Bill 21, which obviously is legislation that helps to encourage more Islamophobia in Canada, and that then leads to violence. And so that would seem to be a relatively straightforward thing to take a stand on, and yet the parties are too afraid of losing votes. So it is about not having a sense of a moral compass. I do think that I wish there were some lessons I haven't learned from the 2015 election, because when the Harper government did sort of embrace Islamophobia, it did seem to get thwacked pretty hard in that election, but that doesn't seem to have carried over to the present day. Kerry, you wanted to intervene on this conversation?
Yeah, I was doing, it's a deformation at NATO. If you do two fingers, it's like you want to jump in on the thing. So I wanted to jump in on Sabina's point, and I don't think it's naive. I do think there are some areas where we can improve our, I won't call it bipartisan, it's US, but common approach across some of the political parties to some key foreign policy issues. We need better mechanisms for allowing access to intel. This has become a political football, and honestly, the direction some parties want it to go would see Canada cut off from the sources of most intelligence we get now. I don't think that's the way to go. But there is a way to have tighter control, to have access with it in a tightly controlled environment, to help people actually understand some of the nuances and to build some of that trust. The second thing is foreign policy. We don't look at foreign policy during elections, and we don't look at foreign policy between elections. And I actually think Canada is a dilettante and sleepwalking into a world where the US won't be as reliable as we think it is to always protect us and in the ways that we need. And we need to wake up. So how do we wake up? I think leadership matters. I think we need a more consistent approach to talking about foreign policy issues in our country. Think about things like regular white papers, and white papers that are developed in ways where you engage Canadians across the country. The Defense Policy Review was pretty interesting that way, because there were a number of ways of reaching out to Canadians, reaching out to different interest groups, reaching out to different regions, different ethnicities to say, okay, what do you care about? Not everything showed up in the Defense Policy Review, but what ended up happening was more awareness about the why and the what of our Canadian Armed Forces. Well, that's just one small subset. I really think we should be doing this on the foreign policy front, and we don't. And so we're dealing with a deficit in understanding of what's happening in the world. A rotating door of foreign ministers. We change them up way too frequently. They can't build the relationships. And the deputy ministers of foreign affairs right now, of the four of them, one of them has been on half posting. No other developed country that has diplomatic chops doesn't put people in position to lead their foreign ministries, their aid agencies, who have built those networks and networks of trust around the world. So when shit hits the fan, excuse the language, you pick up the phone and you phone somebody you've worked with. They know you, they trust you, you know them, you trust them, and you can sort it out and you can get coalitions. So when Saudi Arabia, for instance, attacks you, you've got your friends there right away instead of 6 months later, for instance. So that was my rant. So I agree with Sabina that there's more room for public engagement and more kind of political party commonality on some of these issues.
That's great, Kerry. We have started to get some questions from the audience. So I want to raise those with the panel. One question for all the panelists. Can you comment on the substantive discussion thus far in the election campaign regarding Afghan issues, and especially concerns expressed by Canadian Muslim communities? How do we get party leaders to talk about this more directly? Any one of the four of you? Sure, Sabina.
Yeah, I think they need to be asked. They need to be put on the spot.
Mhm.
And if you look at the debate topics, both yesterday in the French debate and the next in the English language debate, foreign policy isn't even on the list. So if you don't put them on the spot, if you don't make it an election issue, it will not be one. And then you can't also expect them to carry it through once they've become elected and actually have to run the country. I mean, we've seen this in our government, and Kerry mentioned, you know, the revolving door and who they've appointed to lead the department. We're not serious when it comes to foreign policy. We are banking on our past history as, you know, the world needs more Canada and we're the wonderful peacekeepers. Well, we're not keeping the peace anymore. And when we try to raise our hand in the public forum, I mean, in the Security Council election, people say, okay, fine, but what have you done for us lately? And we don't have an answer. So it's a question that I think people like you, the media, civil society needs to put pressure on our politicians to understand that Canada's role in the world needs to be addressed, including in domestic politics, but also writ large. We need to re-engage, and we need to have a plan. We need to not just sit on our past laurels and hope that carries us through. But you need to ask the questions.
It may be a self-fulfilling prophecy where the media doesn't think the public cares about foreign policy, so they don't ask questions about foreign policy, so the politicians aren't pushed on it, and then as a result, the public doesn't care about foreign policy. So it might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But as we learned on 9/11, if we don't care about foreign policy still cares about us. So there is a need to think about these issues.
Yeah.
One of the questions that was asked was of Tabasum, but I think it's actually a question for all the panel, which is, how do we engage Afghanistan now? Do we engage the Taliban directly? Do we disengage from Taliban? Do we shift all of our focus to international organizations that will be doing relief efforts in Afghanistan, so that way the Canadians don't have to recognize the government? Any suggestions for how we should go forward? Obviously, again, starting with Tabasum, but everybody else can chime in.
Thank you, Stephen. That's the question on a lot of countries, how to re-engage Afghanistan. The most important first consideration that needs to be made is whether or not to remove them from the sanctions list. You have the Prime Minister of the country who is on the UN sanctions list, and many of his cabinet members have been on the FBI's most wanted list. So before we can even consider re-engaging with them, we have to reevaluate our sanctions list, and that's going to be a very long legal process, not just for Canada, but also for the US and many other Western countries. The focus on the international and humanitarian organizations, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, especially those that are providing healthcare assistance and support, those need to continue. The UN continues to be on the ground in Afghanistan. A few other international organizations are there. There are cries for, or calls for, additional support, especially medical care. I know that there have been a few flights into Kabul airport, mostly from Qatar, delivering humanitarian aid and food. That needs to continue. Countries may not necessarily need to work directly with the government, but if they can find a way around their own procedures, they could do it or channel support through these organizations. There's going to be, I just want to underscore the many issues and challenges that Afghans are going to face. You have obviously insecurity, you have the limits on mobility, especially for certain groups. There's also a drought. The drought has affected food prices. The Afghani has also deteriorated. So you've got all of these issues in addition to the pandemic, and it's a humanitarian crisis already. The world is slowly starting to acknowledge it, and if we sit and wait for the legal processes and try to take the Taliban off the sanctions list before we can start engaging them, we'll lose lives. And by the time we actually get to that part, I fear it'll be too little too late. So the best time to engage, or the best strategy to engage now, is through those humanitarian organizations that are already on the ground.
And I guess one of the lessons to be learned from the last month was the Americans and the Taliban were quite pragmatic for August, not beyond August, but for August. And so that allowed 120,000 people to get out. Now that does speak to a different problem that Afghanistan have, which is brain drain. But in terms of the lessons we learned from that moment is that the Taliban have a mixed record, and we don't, they're making lots of promises. We don't know what they're going to keep, but they can be pragmatic. And so if there is enough desperation within the country, we might be able to work with them on not long-term social change or whatever, but on getting the people fed and making the medical stuff get through, that the money to fund the women in the clinics and things like that. There was a TV show last night on TVO where one of the people was involved in the healthcare scene in Afghanistan. And it's very clear that one of the changes of the past month has been there's no more money coming to the medical community in Afghanistan. And whether there was a pandemic or not, it was a country that was heavily dependent on exactly those resources.
And I just want to, if I can quickly add in there, in 2019, we conducted the first ever disability survey in Afghanistan in 15 years. But even before the pandemic, there was a healthcare crisis. 80% of Afghans had some form of a disability, 80%. 17% of Afghan children under the age of 17 also had some form of a disability. So compounded then with the pandemic and with an already weakening healthcare system, and now with the brain drain, including healthcare professionals, and the impact on health infrastructure, not only just medical aid coming in, there is a healthcare crisis that is just emerging to the surface now. So unless we act now and show support, funding, or any other types of aid, I fear for the health of Afghans, the mental health and the physical health. And as I mentioned earlier, right now is not the time to think about legal frameworks as standing in the way of those healthcare interventions. Right now is the time to act. It's the time to do whatever you can through those humanitarian organizations, the UN or Doctors Without Borders, or whichever other groups are there, and just show them your support, financial or in kind.
Sabine.
Thanks, Stephen. I just want to follow up on the sanctions point. Yes, that will be a huge impediment. And in my previous role, when I was dealing with counterterrorism capacity building, certainly doing anything in Lebanon, as soon as you run into Hezbollah, not only are you running into sanctions issues, but potentially you're also running into Canadian criminal law that prohibits this terrorist financing. So you can't give money to people that you have declared to have been terrorists. So yes, it's a huge problem, but solving it removing those sanctions or deciding that, well, the Taliban is no longer a terrorist organization, which it is in Canadian criminal law. The political capital that would need to be expended on that action. I mean, it's unthinkable. I mean, think of Omar Khadr, for example. He's been cited earlier, who was 15 years old. Well, I don't know, 90% of the Canadians still say lock him up and throw away the key, instead of thinking of him as a kid that's been betrayed by every adult that ever had any role in his life. And so you finding political buy-in for any Canadian government to say, oh, well, the Taliban are no longer terrorists, it's pie in the sky. So we need to find workarounds there to work with civil society and cut out, any kind of assistance to the government. That would be very, very difficult to do. It's possible, but those workarounds would have to be very expertly done, or you run afoul of Canadian law and Canadian political opinion.
And has to wait until after the election is done because nobody wants to act during an election. Navaid.
Thank you so much. I think the point about sending humanitarian aid needs to be emphasized, and Tabasum, emphasized that point greatly, where that aid does need to reach civilian population. And I agree with Sabina's point as well. I'm going to chime in from a different perspective, which is a political vacuum, where if Canada chooses not to engage and other governments choose not to engage, let's look at who is engaging with the Taliban right now. You have China that's engaging, you have Iran that's engaging, you have Pakistan, and you have Qatar. And when we create such a vacuum and that leaves the door open for those governments to engage with them, again, we need to think about the future. Yes, it's great to have this stance that we don't negotiate with terrorists and we don't talk to terrorist entities and organizations. But what is the long-term effect of that? That if we choose not to engage with them, what does that actually mean? And I'm afraid that things will only get worse when we choose not to engage. Yes, there are a lot of legal challenges that we need to get through, as Tabasum greatly highlighted, that a lot of their political leaders are sanctioned and are on terrorist watch lists. But up until we start navigating through those legal issues, just standing as bystanders and not doing anything is even worse. So that's just something I wanted to highlight, that vacuum that we are creating by choosing not to engage can perhaps perpetuate the issue and make things worse.
Well, and something that ties into something you said earlier, and then I'll go to Kerry, which is you said earlier about the contrast between not intervening in Syria and intervening in other places. And as I've been observing the various interventions over the past 20 years, it seems if we invested a great deal, we, the West, invested in Canada, invested a great deal in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and it didn't work out. We tried something in between with Libya, where we tried to, basically remove Gaddafi and then let other folks handle the problem. That didn't work out so well. And I think part of the reason why we didn't get involved in Syria was because it was after Afghanistan, after Iraq, after or while Libya was going on. And so the lesson was not to do anything, and that was a catastrophe. And so, those four conflicts over the past 20 years, I don't know what the lesson to draw is, because nothing worked, whether it was all or nothing or in between. And so the question then is what do we do the next time? Because the Syrian solution really did not work out well. Would we be better off intervening in Syria? It would have been very costly for us, but we might not have had the entire country razed to the ground. And with Assad and staying in power, this was not a good outcome. So are there any lessons to glean from the comparison across those cases about what to do? Given that, again, the justification for 9/11 on the part of Al-Qaeda was American intervention in the Middle East, and what did the United States do afterwards was intervene more. So I'm not exactly sure what the lessons that we learned from all these things are. I'm curious as if there's any takeaways that you have, or any starting points for the next situation, because there will be another situation somewhere in the Middle East. And then after we answer this question, I'd like to turn back to Canada.
Of course. And actually, before I even answer your question, Stephen, I would like to carry the opportunity to respond to the first question, and then I'll answer yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Navid. Yeah, I just want to speak about the Taliban for a second. You'll recall the first time they were in power, at the beginning, there were some fairly reasonable noises from the Taliban, and that very, very quickly proved to be absolutely untrue. And I think we're seeing the same PR move this time around, maybe a bit more sophisticated, maybe a bit more pragmatic, but not much more pragmatic. And you're seeing, there was an edict yesterday that only protests that have been approved by the Taliban will be allowed. 2 journalists were beaten almost to death yesterday, and the list goes on. So I think the idea that sanctions on the Taliban will be lifted anytime soon, I don't think that will happen, and nor do I necessarily think it should. I do think that money direct to the Taliban should be a non-starter, but I also know that engagement with the Taliban has been going on for a long time, and it needs to, right? So the humanitarian organizations on the ground have been working with the Taliban. They've had to in order to ensure that some people in Taliban-controlled areas weren't forgotten, but also from a very pragmatic perspective. And don't forget, there are worse actors out there in Afghanistan. There's ISKP or ISK, much worse. And although they're kind of nominally allied with the Taliban, they're also competitors of the Taliban. I think we'll see very soon, what we saw at the Kabul airport attack, some real challenges. So I think our starting point on engaging with the Taliban goes back to what the polling showed. Majority of Afghans want elected leaders. They don't want an imposed emirate, and that's what the Taliban is seeking to do right now. So as the international community engages with the Taliban, don't remove the sanctions, and engage with them in a way that doesn't disadvantage the Afghan people by giving the Taliban more clout than they deserve to have based on their legitimacy or lack of it with the Afghan people. So that's my point on the Taliban.
Thank you. Navaid?
Give me just a few more seconds to think about the question that you posed. And I think that is always a challenge, where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Intervening can be problematic, and not intervening can be problematic. So with that being said, I think 2 things that I would like to highlight is that the civilian population always needs to be the priority. And I think as long as our primary focus is to help, to empower, to take care of, to protect civilian population, then that is always something that needs to be considered. No government should be allowed to annex and to kill and to bomb and to raid its own population, like we saw in Syria and in other places. So that always needs to be paramount to considering civilian population. Number 2, and again, I recognize that this is going to be naive and idealistic, but also empowering people to choose their own governments. Should people not have their own individualistic choice to choose the people that govern them, right? Rather than us making those decisions. And again, perhaps this applies more to the United States, but I remember reading a book where, there was approximately 100 or so more interventions by the United States in empowering certain political leaders over others, where I think this is where part of the problem is, where we should not have that right to dictate who gets to govern people. So I know that it wasn't of much help, but protect civilian population, empower them, and then give them the right to choose who governs them, right? Those would be my thoughts.
Sabine?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with everything Kerry said about essentially constructive engagement without giving legitimacy or money. I think that's how I would put it fairly quickly. One thing that we also need to do is we need to not just look at Afghanistan, but we need to look at the next Afghanistan and prevent it from happening. I spent some time in Ghana, and of course, in neighboring Burkina Faso, you have the encroachment already of Al-Qaeda related groups, and they were starting incursions into northern Ghana. If you don't do development and security capacity building hand in hand in some of the areas where you essentially have empty spaces as far as governance is concerned, if you have a great ungoverned space, that's the place where terrorism finds a hold and will come back and bite you. And that was certainly the issue in Afghanistan, I think 20 years ago. We need to look at those. We need to provide the necessary development assistance hand in hand with security assistance. And for that, we need to de-silo some of our own approaches, because in our own world, the development folks don't talk to the security folks. They're just different groups, and never the twain shall meet, but they need to go hand in hand. So we need to work much more on prevention. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, I want to, I promised our panelists we'd be here for an hour and a half. We're going over that time limit. And so what I want to do is I want to say thanks to the audience for attending our panel today. I want to thank the staff of the CSN, particularly Melissa Jennings, Kahab Mohammed, and Rachel Wallace and Paxton Mayer for helping us set this up. But most of all, I want to thank our speakers. I learned a lot over the past hour and a half, and I hope to have a chance to talk with you more in the future. So thank you to Tabasum, Sabine, Kerry, and Navaid. You provided some perspectives that we don't hear enough in this town or in this country, and we hope that we can share your views more so in the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. It was a lot of fun. Very interesting. And thanks to my fellow panelists as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
And I think we're out.
And there's just a few more people here.
I am unable to set it up in a practice session, so I'll just close and reopen this exact link.
That's okay. You don't have to. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. Navaid, we particularly want to reach out to you again in the future because again, we don't hear enough from the people who are affected by our policies. So I really appreciate your time today. And Kerry, thanks again for coming out. I've got to go teach in 15 minutes, so that I had to put a hard cap on this thing anyway. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Take care and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Kerry.